Do you remember, what do we call this whole bone? All of it together. This is my, any idea? My hip bone or my, not the pelvis, it's not the pelvis, it's part of the pelvis. It's my hip bone or what we call the coxal bone. The pelvis is formed by two hip bones and the sacrum. This is what forms the pelvic girdle. All right, so again, what do we call the whole bone on here? It's my hip bone or coxal bone. If you remember, the deep sockets that I have in here, where I've got the articulation with the head of the femur to form the hip joint, this is my acetabulum. Acetabulum. And if you remember, what again is the acetabulum here? 58 is asking what's articulating with the acetabulum. It's the head of the femur. To form what joint, if you remember? To form the hip joint. Looking on here, if you remember, this was the ischial bone. And it has a process protruding backward. So we call this is my ischial spine. Ischial spine. And if you remember, I've got a large notch above it. This is where a large nerve gonna be traveling, called the sciatic nerve. If you remember, we call this is my greater sciatic notch. I've got this bone depression where the sciatic nerve is gonna be traveling. This is my greater sciatic notch. Looking on here, if you remember this bony ridge that I have in the ilium, this is my iliac crest. Iliac crest. And I have a spine which is located anterior and superior in the iliac bone. So we call this is my anterior superior iliac spine. Anterior superior iliac spine, because you have four of those spines. You have anterior superior, anterior inferior, posterior superior, posterior inferior. So the most superior and anterior one, it's my superior anterior superior iliac spine. Anterior superior iliac spine. Looking at this bone, this is my collarbone, the clavicle. And if you remember, the clavicle has two ends. I have a bulging end, a rounded end on here, a thick end. This is my sternal end. This is where I will be articulating with the sternum. Sternal end. And I have a flattened end. This is what's going to be articulating with my acromial process of the scapula. So we call this is my acromial end. Other names for sternal and acromial. Sternal is also called the medial end, and the acromial end is also called the lateral end. Sternal end is this rounded, thick end of the clavicle. The flattened end that you see on here, this is the acromial end or the lateral end. Again, what's number 64 articulating with? It's articulating with the acromion of the scapula. Articulating with the acromion of the scapula. All right, don't worry about 65 on here. About 66 7, it's marking this shallow cavity of my scapula. This is my glenoid cavity. How would I figure out whether this bone is right or left? Remember, glenoid cavity should be directed to the outside, and should be directed, the spine should be directed posteriorly. So, and the acromion is directed superiorly. So this is up, this is down, this is down, this is away from the midline, this is going posteriorly. So putting those three directions into perspective, we're gonna figure out that this is a right scapula. Exactly. If you remember, a process that we've seen in the scapula located anteriorly, this is my coracoid process, not coronoid, because the coronoid process is the one in the mandible. We don't have number 70 on the list. All right, this is called the superior scapular notch. We don't have neither 71 on the list. This is the fossa. We've stated it in the class, but we still don't have it on the list. It's gonna be the fossa located above the spine of the scapula. So we call this is my supraspinous fossa. Supraspinous fossa. Which one is a female pelvis? Which one is a male pelvis? Can you guess here? Which one, A or B, is a female pelvis? Which one is a female pelvis? Why did we choose this one here, A? Because you see the pubic arch, it has an obtuse angle. It has a wide angle compared to the male pelvis on here. It's gonna have a narrow angle and a much smaller pelvic brim. Looking at 73, what is 73 pointing to? If you remember, this is my humerus. Why didn't I say this is the femur? Because if you remember, the femur has a long neck. You can't confuse the humerus to the femur. Here, I don't have a long neck like I do have in the femur. So you can't say this is the femur, the one thing. All right, so here we're looking at the humerus. This is the head of the humerus. This is the greater tubercle. This is the lesser tubercle. This is my deltoid tuberosity. Looking here at the lower end of the humerus, and we can see two articular surfaces. If you remember, one is spherical, that looks like a head, and one is cylindrical in shape. The cylindrical one is the one that can be seen from a posterior view. If you remember, the cylindrical articular surface in the distal end of the humerus is what we call the trochlea. And if you remember, the trochlea articulates with, as you see on here, this notch, my trochlear notch of my ulna. So trochlea articulates here with the trochlear notch of the ulna. All right, so name the bone on here. It's my humerus. And what do you think? Is this right or left? Head should be directed medially. This is anterior. So also head should be superior. I'm going to see on here. So if you try to fit it in your body, in which direction, in which side will it fit? Putting this into perspective. This is directed medially. The olecranon fossa was posterior. So this is a posterior view. This is an anterior view of the bone. Oh, it is a right humerus. Exactly. Right humerus. If you remember, this bony eminence, this large bony eminence on the opposing side to the head of the humerus, this is what we call my greater tubercle. And if I'm looking at the lower end of the humerus, we've seen this spherical articular surface that looks like a head. This is my capitulum. And if you remember, the capitulum was articulating with the head of the radius. You see on here, the head of the radius on here is what articulates with the capitulum of the humerus. Another very important marking on here, if you remember, that we've had in the distal end of the humerus was the olecranon fossa. Moving on here, what bone is it? What bone is 78? The one with the notch and this process on here. This is my ulna. How about this bone on here? On the outside of the forearm. Doesn't have a notch, but it has a rounded head. This is my radius. Those are the two bones of the forearm. What do we call this depression in the bone that we see, number 79? It's my trochlear notch. If you remember, what do we call this large process in the ulna that passes to the inside of the olecranon fossa? If the fossa is called the olecranon fossa, if you remember, what do we call the process that passes to the inside of this fossa? This is my olecranon process. Olecranon process. Olecranon process. Looking 82, here is asking about the radius. What is the bone on here? And if you remember, this pointed bony eminence that I have towards the distal end of the radius, this is what we've called the styloid process of the radius. And if you remember, we've got another styloid process, this time that is part of the ulna. This is the styloid process of the ulna. So why I don't just say styloid process, if you remember, why I don't just say styloid process without of the radius or of the ulna, because if you remember, we've got in the skull a styloid process, and this is the ones that I won't specify of which bone. So if you told me styloid process, just a styloid process by itself, like this, without specifying whether it's of the radius or of the ulna, what I will understand is that you're referring to this process on here. All right, so it's very important to be as specific as possible in the exam. So styloid process of the radius, styloid process of the ulna, be as specific as possible. So you see on here, this is my styloid process of the ulna. For this test, no. For this test, no. For this test, no. But you're going to be provided with a very long list of choices, which is very similar as typing down the answer. All right. So is it going to be, if you did try to complete the quiz, it's going to be the same style as the quiz. It's gonna be the same style as the quiz. Did you try to take the quiz? Any of you? You have 3 attempts to complete the quiz, so try to do it as early as possible for you to get an impression about how the exam looks like. All right, so you even if you didn't do well the first 1 or 2 times, you're gonna still have a chance to improve it because I make it available for you to complete it in 3 attempts. All right. All right, moving on to the bones of the hand on here. If you remember, we have the carpal bones, metacarpal bones, and the phalanges. If you remember the carpal bones, you start with a proximal row starting from the thumb. How did I figure out that this is the thumb? It has a proximal phalanx and a distal phalanx. So start here, Sally left the party. Then I start again from lateral to medial to take Kathy home. All right, so Sally was scaphoid. Then lunate, triquetral, and we have here, this is my PZ form. So somebody was asking me how to not get confused between the 3 T's. So we've got tri, you start with tri, 3, triquetral is the first one that comes. And then I have a trapezium that has 4 angles, trapezium. And then a smaller one. It looks like a trapezium, but it's smaller in size, so it calls this is the trapezoid. And then we've got the capitate, and finally the hemate. If you remember, for the metacarpal bones, we don't give them names, but we give them numbers. So what is this bone that is marked? This is my first metacarpal bone. First metacarpal bone. So what is the most common wrong answer here for the first metacarpal bone? People identify this as a proximal phalanx. The most common wrong answer, it's the proximal phalanx. Why it's not the proximal phalanx and this one is the middle phalanx and this one is the distal phalanx? Because simply what I am missing here, it's the middle phalanx. None of the fingers is missing a metacarpal bone. None of the fingers is missing a metacarpal bone. All of them have their metacarpal bones. The thumb only is missing the middle phalanx. All right, is this clear? Is this clear? All right, so what is the name of the bone on here? What's the bone that we're looking at? It has a rounded head. And this is the femur. If you remember, femur, the head is directed inwards, medial. The intercondylar notch, this space on here between the 2 condyles was posterior. So this is directed inwards towards the midline. This is posterior, and of course the head is directed upwards, as you see on here. So what is the side of this bone? Is this right or left? What do you think? It's right. It's a right femur. What do you think about number 90? 90. The head of the femur. How about this large bony eminence on the opposing side to the head? So on the other side of the head, to the head. This is my greater, but not tubercle like the femur, like the humerus. It's what we call, what do we call this? It's a trochanter, exactly. It's a greater trochanter. If you remember, we've got those articular surfaces. Those are my medial and lateral condyles. What do you think? Is this marked one? Is it the medial condyle or the lateral condyle of the femur? How would I know? Is it on the same side as the head? If it's on the same side as the head, this means it's a medial condyle. How about this one? It's on the opposite side to the head. So this is going to be a lateral condyle. How about the space located between the two condyles? What do we call this? Is my intercondylar notch, or in some textbooks they would say it's an intercondylar fossa. All right, what do we call this bony eminence above the condyles? Above is epi, and I'm located above the condyle, so I will call it an epicondyle. And it's on the same side, as you see on here, it's on the same side as the head of the femur. So we call this is my medial epicondyle. Medial epicondyle. How about this bone? What do you think? What is the name of the bone on here? This triangular shaped bone. This is my kneecap. We call it the patella. And what is it articulating with? What's articulating with this side of the patella? It's the patellar surface of the femur. So the patella is articulating with the patellar surface of the femur. How about number 98 on here? What bone is this? The thin bone of the leg. What do we call this bone on here? It's my fibula. And what do we call the large bone of the leg located on the medial aspect? This is my tibia. And if you remember, towards the lower end, each of them has a malleolus. So what do we call the malleolus of the fibula? As a fibula, it's located laterally, so we call this is my lateral malleolus. And this will be the medial malleolus. All right, what do you think this is on here? If you remember, elliptic shaped articular surface, it's a condyle. And would this be the medial condyle or the lateral condyle? According to, is it on the same side as the medial malleolus, or is it on the opposing side to the medial malleolus? If it's on the same side as the medial malleolus, it's going to be the medial condyle. But it's not. It's on the opposite side to the medial malleolus. So how would what's going to be the name here? I'm sorry. If it's on the opposite side to the medial malleolus, so it's going to be my lateral condyle. Lateral condyle. All right, don't worry about the joint on here. Looking at the bones of the foot, if you remember, we've got tarsal bones, we've got metatarsal bones, and we've got the phalanges. The tarsal bones, if you remember, we start from the big toe going outwards. So we start here. This is the most medial bone. This is my medial cuneiform. Then I have my intermediate cuneiform, my lateral cuneiform. Posteriorly, all the three are articulating with my navicular bone. Navicular bone. Navicular bone. Navicular bone along with the lateral cuneiform are articulating with a cube-shaped bone on here. This is my cuboid. And if you remember, the bone that transmits the weight down from the tibia to be distributed to the rest of the tarsal bones, this is my talus. And the bone located underneath it, this is my talus on here. And the bone located underneath it, forming your heels, this is the calcaneus. All right, so again, the tarsal bones are medial cuneiform, intermediate cuneiform, lateral cuneiform. All the three are articulating posteriorly with the navicular bone. Laterally, lateral cuneiform along with the navicular are articulating with the cuboid bone. Talus transmits the weight down from the tibia to the rest of the tarsal bones, including the bone of the heels. This is going to be the calcaneus. Calcaneus. You see on here, this is a big toe. We've got the phalanx, which is located away from the point of origin. So this is going to be my distal phalanx. Distal phalanx. All right, this is a quick overview of a good portion of what you should be able to identify and know for this upcoming exam. This doesn't include everything that you need to know. This doesn't include everything that you need to know, but includes a good part of it, like 80% or more of the information. Again, in order for you to study all the information, please use the provided PowerPoint presentations along with the list of bones, the need to knows list of bones and bone markings that is posted under Unit 2 module on Canvas. Any questions? Any questions? How many hours I'm expecting an average person to spend studying the bone? At least 48 hours of focused studying. At least 48 hours of focused studying. So it's not something that you will study during breaks at work or while you're playing with your kids. All right, it's not something that you will be able to do while you're doing something else. You need to be fully dedicated to study the material for at least 48 hours for you to be able to master the information that we need to know for this upcoming exam. All right.